There are moments in a man's life when the past no longer whispers. It presses its weight against the ribs, demanding to be spoken. At 70, Stephen Merchant finally allowed himself to break the silence he had carried for decades. The room was dim, lit only by the soft glow of a single lamp, its light fading across the contours of his face like the last trace of an old memory. He sat still for a long time before he spoke, as though choosing his words meant reopening wounds he had tried to seal with time alone. Fame never protected him from solitude. If anything, it sharpened it. Behind the laughter, behind the towering presence on screen, there had always been a quiet shadow walking beside him, one made of betrayals, disappointments, and the unanswered questions left by people he once trusted. He rarely addressed it. He preferred humor, distraction, work, anything that kept him from turning his gaze backward. But that evening, something shifted. His voice trembled just slightly, barely enough for most to notice, yet impossible to ignore once it was heard. "There are 5 people," he murmured, eyes lowered as though staring into a mirror long avoided. "5 people I have never forgiven, and perhaps never will." The air around him thickened, the kind of silence that doesn't fall, it sinks. Who were these people? What had they taken from him? And why had their names survived all these years while everything else faded? Those answers were not given easily. They waited in the shadows of his past, in places he rarely revisited, in stories he never wished to tell. But tonight he had decided to unveil them, one wound at a time. The silence that wrapped around Stephen that night did not begin at 70. It was born long before the spotlight ever found him. Back in Bristol, in a modest house where evenings were quiet and the walls seemed to listen more than the people inside them. He was a tall, lanky boy even then, awkward in a way that made him both noticeable and strangely invisible. Children teased him for his height, adults underestimated him, and somewhere between those two worlds he learned the art of holding his feelings close, as if exposing them might invite harm. His parents were kind, but life was not always gentle. His father worked long hours, returning home tired yet patient, while his mother kept the household steady, though there were days when her silence felt heavier than her words. Stephen often found himself alone in his room, radio humming in the background, imagining lives far larger than the one he knew. Humor became a refuge, not a performance, a way to soften a world that sometimes felt too sharp. There was an early lesson he never forgot. People could disappoint you without meaning to. A childhood friend, one he trusted more than anyone, simply drifted away one summer, leaving no explanation. That quiet abandonment carved the first small hollow in him, a place where mistrust would eventually root itself. Years later, he would look back and realize how deeply that simple vanishing shaped his understanding of loyalty. As he grew older, his height became the first thing people noticed, and humor became the first thing he offered to make them stay. But inside, a quieter truth formed, a belief that affection was fragile, that connection could disappear without warning. He learned to observe, to analyze, to read the room before stepping into it. It made him sharp. It also made him guarded. The seed of not forgiving did not begin with anger. It began with confusion, then loss, then the slow understanding that some wounds don't bleed. They echo. And Stephen carried those echoes with him, even as he stepped toward the life that would change everything. His rise did not happen in a burst of fireworks. It unfolded like a long, deliberate climb up a staircase he wasn't sure he had the right to ascend. Stephen left Bristol with the same mix of hope and caution that had shaped his childhood. University gave him air, space to expand, to experiment, to discover that humor could be more than a shield. It could be a craft, a language, a doorway. But even as he made others laugh, he still felt like the tall boy standing at the edge of the room, watching the world from a distance. Everything changed the day he met another young man with a restless mind and a burning desire to turn ordinary life into extraordinary storytelling. Ricky Gervais. Their connection was electric, charged by curiosity and irreverence. Two misfits discovering they could reshape comedy itself. Together they built something audacious, raw, uncomfortable, painfully honest. The Office became a phenomenon, but before it became famous, It was simply two voices whispering into the dark, hoping someone would hear them. Success arrived suddenly, like a spotlight flicked on without warning. Audiences adored them, critics praised them, and Stephen, once unsure of where he fit, found himself shaping a new era of British humor. Yet with every step upward, a familiar tension followed him. He smiled for cameras, accepted awards, shook hands with people who had once ignored him. But beneath the applause lay a faint vibration of doubt, an unspoken fear that all this could disappear as abruptly as his childhood friend once had. Fame magnified everything, the achievements, the scrutiny, the expectations. He was tall enough to be seen from afar, but the higher he stood, the lonelier the platform became. Interviews grew less about his work and more about his height, his oddness, his place beside louder personalities. He learned to play along, to keep the spotlight from revealing too much, to use humor as both sword and shield. But cracks began to show. Creative tension surfaced. Disagreements sharpened. The partnership that had once felt like destiny began to feel like confinement. And as their paths shifted, Stephen found himself confronting a truth he had tried to outrun. Success does not silence old doubts. It amplifies them. There were moments late at night when the applause seemed to echo rather than embrace. Moments when he wondered whether people admired him or merely admired standing next to the people they already adored. Moments when trust wavered, when loyalties blurred, when promises made in dimly lit rooms dissolved under brighter lights. His ascent was real, brilliant, transformative, undeniable, but woven through it was a quiet erosion, a slow accumulation of fractures. And in those fractures, the first shadows of unforgiven names began to stir again, preparing to return in ways he could no longer ignore. The fractures that had once been barely visible soon deepened into unmistakable lines. Lines Stephen could no longer pretend weren't there. Success had opened doors, but it had also sharpened every shadow, revealing truths he had tried to dismiss as passing discomfort. The first rupture did not arrive in a dramatic explosion. It arrived quietly, almost politely, the way disappointment often does. A conversation that ended too abruptly, a promise ignored, a creative decision taken without him. Little things, but they accumulated like drops of water carving a canyon one fall at a time. He had always been sensitive to shifts in loyalty, perhaps too sensitive. Growing up with the fear that people could simply disappear, he learned to read the subtle signals. The glance exchange behind his back, the meeting he wasn't invited to, the way someone's tone softened when they wanted something, but turned brittle when they didn't. Comedy, he realized, was not just collaboration. It was negotiation. And not everyone negotiated with honesty. There was one moment he remembered with painful clarity. A project, one he had poured months of thought and care into, was suddenly restructured without his input. Decisions were made in rooms where his chair sat empty. Explanations were vague. Apologies were gentle, almost patronizing. It wasn't betrayal in the dramatic sense. It was betrayal through exclusion, through the quiet rewriting of boundaries. And for someone who had spent years fighting to be seen beyond his height and his humor, it cut deeply. Then came the public misunderstandings, articles twisting his words, interviews that painted him as the other half, the quieter half, the unnecessary half. He told himself he didn't care, but he did, because it echoed the old wound, the fear of being replaceable. Confrontations followed, some calm, some sharp. Words raised, then withdrawn, but never forgotten. And in the aftermath, Stephen felt something inside him shift permanently. Trust, once cracked, did not return to its original shape. He withdrew, not dramatically but deliberately. Fewer collaborations, fewer risks, more silence. The names of those who hurt him settled into his memory like stones dropped into deep water. Silent, heavy, impossible to retrieve without stirring the whole lake. And from that depth, the list of 5 began to form. 5 names, 5 silences, 5 fractures that shaped the man Stephen Merchant became. He never wrote them down, never spoke them aloud, never allowed them to drift too close to the surface. Yet they lived inside him all the same. Quiet, persistent, etched into the folds of memory like faint scars that never fully healed. Not enemies, not villains. Just people whose departure or deception carved deeper marks than they ever knew. The first person entered his life with the softness of a spring breeze. Light, warm, seemingly harmless. She was a collaborator from his earliest creative attempts, someone whose laughter made the long hours feel less lonely and whose kindness disarmed the guarded young man he once was. They shared dreams, ambition, and the fragile optimism of people who believed they were building something meaningful. Then, as quickly as she had arrived, she vanished into a better offer, leaving not a confrontation but an absence. She apologized politely as though stepping out of his life were a simple logistical shift. But for Stephen, who still carried the ache of early abandonment, her departure reopened a wound he thought time had softened. He didn't resent her success. He resented the way she left without looking back. The second person struck like a sudden winter gust, sharp, unexpected, undeniable. He was a creative partner, someone Stephen trusted with ideas too raw to show the world. Their collaboration had energy, rhythm, a sense of possibility. Then Stephen discovered the quiet meetings, the private decisions, the scripts revised without his knowledge. When he confronted the partner, the explanation was wrapped in cold professionalism. This is how things work. But Stephen had never approached art as machinery. To him, it was connection. Messy, honest, shared. That betrayal wasn't dramatic. It was procedural, calculated, done behind closed doors. And maybe that was why it hurt more. It taught him that trust could be undermined not by malice, but by convenience. The third person left the deepest wound, one that reached far beyond career, touching the core of who he believed himself to be. This person belonged to the private world he rarely let the public see. Family. Their relationship had always been complicated, a tangle of affection and unspoken expectations. During a bitter dispute, they dismissed Stephen's accomplishments with a single, cutting sentence. "You're only where you are because of the people around you." Said in anger, yes, but the kind of anger that reveals truths someone has long been waiting to spill. It wasn't just insult, it was erasure. And to a man who had fought for his place inch by inch, it struck at the root of his identity. He replayed those words more times than he cared to admit. Years later, he still felt the sting. The fourth person harmed him not in private, but in the full glare of public light. A journalist, sharp, opportunistic, published a piece that turned his insecurities into spectacle. They mocked his appearance, his quietness, even his creative contributions, framing him as a mere accessory to bigger personalities. The article spread quickly, faster than truth ever could. People laughed, shared it, repeated its lines as though they were harmless jokes. Stephen smiled through interviews, pretending none of it mattered. But it did. Not because the journalist had power, but because the article confirmed the fear he had carried since childhood, that the world saw him as a footnote, not a figure. That fear became a quiet companion, shaping the way he approached fame ever after. And then there was the fifth, the one he hid from himself for years, the one he could not outrun, the one he could not excuse or forget. It was Stephen. It was the version of himself who avoided confrontation to keep the peace, the version who allowed silence to replace boundaries, the version who stepped back in moments when he should have stepped forward, the version who let old fears dictate new choices, the version who doubted himself even when the world applauded. He could forgive others for ambition, selfishness, anger, thoughtlessness. What he could not forgive was his own complicity, the times he betrayed his own potential, the moments he withheld his voice, the hesitations that cost him opportunities he never reclaimed. And perhaps that is why the fifth name weighed the heaviest. Because to forgive oneself is to acknowledge the choices that could have been different, the life that might have unfolded, the courage that arrived too late. One wound from a colleague, one from a friend, one from a family member, one from the public, and one from himself. 5 people, 5 echoes, and together they shaped the silence he carried through the years. The room returned to silence after Stephen finished speaking, as if even the air needed a moment to adjust to the weight of what had been revealed. He leaned back in his chair, shoulders softened, the strain around his eyes easing into something almost peaceful. Not relief exactly, more like recognition. For the first time in years, he had placed each of those memories in the light instead of carrying them through dim corridors of his mind. Outside, the evening dimmed into a soft gray, the kind of twilight that blurs edges and makes everything appear distant yet strangely intimate. Stephen watched the light fade across the window pane, and in that fading he saw the shape of his own life. Uneven, marked by brilliance and shadow, but undeniably his. The five names no longer felt like weights pulling him backward. They felt like chapters, unfinished perhaps, but acknowledged. He picked up a small notebook from the desk, one he had carried for decades, its pages filled with ideas, jokes, half-formed thoughts. Tucked between two worn sheets was an old photograph of himself in his 20s, smiling with a confidence he did not yet understand. He stared at it for a long time, then placed it back with a gentleness that suggested, if not forgiveness, then at least acceptance. As the last trace of daylight slipped away, Stephen whispered almost to himself, "Some wounds don't close. They just stop hurting as much." And with that, the quiet settled again, softer this time, less demanding. Can a life truly move forward without forgiveness? Or do we sometimes keep the pain simply to remember that we once cared?